first share from Christie's Dropbox account to me, but
No, but I'm using your Dropbox account.
Are you?
There we go, guys. We're
Believe so.
We're live.
Yeah, we're live.
I believe.
Lovely.
There we go.
Janik.
There we go. Oh, hang on. Oof, sorry, that was really surreal. When we go live, I can hear myself twice, but delayed. So there you go.
Not
So
just the man in your head talking back to you, but
yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
So we're looking at
looking
at the concept of death, dying, killing, how it's described, perceived, and what approaches there were to either kill or capture opponents. A very good, pithy statement from Vim. So Murray, I think Murray came back with some ideas straight off.
oh, good.
Good. So, Murray, let's put this to you. You had some thoughts which might kick us off. Thinking of great deaths. How important is it to die well?
Well, I think the ancient world has a whole pile of great death sort of obsession, if you like. I mean, probably Leonidas, King Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae is one of the sort of the most famous great deaths of not just King Leonidas, but his entire bodyguard. But when you start to spread the net wider, you've got lots of anecdotal and historical accounts which concentrate on the deaths of heroes and warriors, all the way from the Iliad onwards, and in both Greek and Roman contexts, and not just military ones. So, when you look at the Iliad is mostly about killing and quite gory. The sword point passing between the third and the fourth ribbon coming out the shoulder blade, and eyeballs getting stomped on in Julius Caesar, and all sorts of amazing
That was a jump.
imagery. Well, just I'm trying to be inclusive of the entire period. That there's accounts of great deaths. And even Ammianus Marcellinus has people dying at the siege of Armida in such a crush that the body couldn't fall over because there were so many people around them holding the body up. And Aemilius Paulus being skewered by so many spears that he couldn't fall over, and that's repeated in several battles. Cainagerius at the Battle of Marathon, who gets his arm chopped off holding onto the prow of a Persian ship, and it sort of sails off with his hands still attached. There's all of that, and that's just off the top of the head. All of those imageries about great deaths exist throughout the ancient world, and they're not just military. You get domestic death as well. So you get anecdotes of Seneca's death, and also Petronius, robbing Nero of the chance to kill him. All those sorts of defiant deaths. There's one of my favorites is a little bit obscure, which is Cato's daughter, who swallows hot coals rather than be. Is that Cato's daughter? No, someone swallows hot coals rather than be tortured. So she basically kills herself by eating a hot coal, which is just the most horrible
That sounds pretty
concept.
horrible, yeah.
It's the nature of the death that you liked rather than who it was. You can't remember.
Yeah.
Porcia.
No, sorry,
It was
it's Porcia, but no, I think Porcius is different. I think that was the freedwoman Epicharis in the reign of Nero.
Yeah, Porcia's death. This is just me quickly Googling. This is not something I had ready. Porcia's death has been a fixation. This Wikipedia, has been a fixation for many historians and writers. It was believed by a majority of contemporary historians that Porcia committed suicide in 42 BC, reputedly by swallowing hot coals.
Oh,
modern historians found this tale implausible. An amazing story. Yes,
but I think
I
did. Well, I'm glad shouldn't have doubted myself. The fact is that those sorts of images of death, and and we have sculpture, because you've got from the very earliest parts of Greek art the most identifiable motif when geometric art starts to have not just a funerary scene, which you can't actually give any specificity to. Clearly, I'm awake because I can say specificity. I even repeated it. You've got the death of Patroclus and Ajax carrying Achilles' body. Those are the two most identifiable sort of anecdotes, and you start to get lots of death elements. The death of Penthesilea, the dying Gaul gets copied not only in sculpture, but then the Romans copy it all over over the shop. So there's amazing moments within Greek and Roman history where the death and the act of dying is the thing that's focused on, not the life up to that point, not the heroic anecdote where anyone escapes. It's kind of the death. And again, when you look at Greek tragedy and Roman tragedy, it's all about death and the inescapable trauma that leads up to the death, even when some of them have death all the way through.
And becoming a god.
Yeah, I think, yes.
I was going to say, does it matter if it's a crap death? Do they have to be great deaths?
I don't think there's too much emphasis on ignominious death.
That's a much better way of putting it.
There's a couple of really frustrating things in Herodotus where he tells us he's going to talk about the death at the Battle of Thermopylae again, for instance. He says, I'll return to the death of Ephialtes later. And it's one of only 3 unfulfilled promises he makes, one's being the history of Assyria. But that's quite like, oh, that's unfortunate. And I mean, even I'm just trying to think of ignominious death.
Well, Nero, because he can't kill himself.
True. Mark Antony.
Yeah,
Mark Antony gets all missed with the dagger. Have another go. So go.
Yep.
So
yeah. And I suppose Caracalla, murdered in his bath.
Yeah.
Yep.
Actually, Agamemnon.
Oh yes. True.
Well, I don't know. Can you call that ignominious, or is that
embarrassing?
Is it playing upon other themes that overtake it?
Yeah.
Well, that's always the fact that we're naming some people who are not necessarily entirely without blemish. Is that just cherry on the story of?
Yeah, is it a fitting?
He had it coming.
Yeah, is it some enemies that really get a good death still? I've been doing a lot on looking at the Catiline conspiracy again recently, and Catiline gets his death, even after everything that Cicero said about him and all the bad stories that he dredges up and whatnot. Still, Catiline is set to, at the end, show all these good qualities in the final battle and run into the thick of the enemy and die with all wounds on his front. And so give this glorious death, even though he's up until now been, demonized in every possible way.
Yeah, well, that's a fabulous segue into that, that obsession as well. That the wounds in front, we've got stories of Africanus, stripping off in the Senate to show all the wounds in front, which is another sort of, even if you haven't died, you've shown the quality of. That if you had, you would have died in the most manly manner possible because your wounds were all in front, and you therefore hadn't run away. And that anecdote goes from the earliest Greek lyric poetry onwards throughout the Roman and Greek worlds. And we've got a couple of is it Ovid has one, and there's I can't remember his name, the spelling, but there's 2 poets who make the opposite point of I've run away, but I threw away my shield, but it doesn't matter, I can just buy me another one. But those
Archilochus.
Archilochus, that's it. There you go. Oh, no wonder. Those 2 contrast with the rest of the material, which is all about don't step backwards, stand in the battle line, and face front, and don't be afraid of war's spears and shafts. So even if you're not going to die, the whole anecdote is, and the whole sort of attitude is that you need to be facing the front, and that's very consistent throughout the ancient world, really.
I was in possibly slight in relation to that. We have one of my favorite questions we had sent in from Oxygen. From Facebook. How did the ancients distinguish between brave, self-sacrificing death in battle and being a bloody idiot that wastes his life?
That's a very interesting question, because the Romans actually had a ritual by which they could sacrifice. A general could sacrifice himself, go knowingly to his doom, but do so for the benefit of his army, and it was called devotio. What he would do is that, and the instances of devotio come from the Republican period, especially the early Republican period, and essentially what it was, and more or less contained to one family. Publius Decius Mus was a consul who, in it's 340 BC, there's a battle in the vicinity of Vesuvius, and the Romans are fighting the Samnites, and Mus says the battle's not going well, and there's a ritual which he has to perform. He calls over the one of the Roman priests, and he says, "Tell me what the ritual is." He stands on his spear. He devotes both himself and the enemy troops to the gods of the underworld. And the idea is that by doing something so dramatic, so self-sacrificing, so noble, that the victory would be given to the Romans by the gods, and then he charges into battle and he's felled by the enemy army, but the Romans win the day. And the devotio was also employed by another Publius Decius Mus at the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, in which the Romans also won the battle.
Yeah, you wonder if that anecdote's invented after they won. I don't know. It's strange, isn't it?
Well, Livy himself, Livy himself. Go ahead.
Because it basically matches the idea of going from Romulus onwards, with them vowing their temples or vowing their shrines, and it's just an extension of that religious practice. So whether you can sort of class it as, is this a death? Would it be seen as or viewed as by the Romans a death that reflects on the individual, or is it more, just would they just be saying it's the extension of our religious practice by a serving priest?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can maybe turn the question, answer the second part of the question, or turn it around maybe, is that if you're going to do something really stupid on the battlefield, you better make sure you die.
Livy himself, does.
Don't go and survive a battle that you caused to be lost because you were an idiot.
Livy himself, after reporting the stories about these two instances of devotio, undercuts his message about them by saying, the Romans pretty much were already winning, or they won without. It was actually the general on the other side, the consul on the other side of the battlefield, who really won the day. So he's relating the story and then also telling you that there was an actual bedrock reason why, tactical reason why the Romans won. But it's a fascinating story because that the Romans had apparently a ritual for this, which, as I said earlier, required them to stand on their spear and recite an actual litany that he needed the, I want to say he had to call the pontifex over to him to help him recite the prayer to the gods, and then went on into battle. And now, mind you, these two instances date from the early Republican period, where just so much of Roman history is if you want to call it semi-legendary, embroidered legend. There's a lot of things in there that don't strike me as being 100% historical.
I think we had a long time ago, we had an article in Ancient Warfare where somebody tried to see if I can easily find it. I think he tried to prove or sort of discuss what would happen if you say that such a consul devoted himself and just crashed himself, horse and all, into the enemy battle line, because that would break up the line and therefore maybe cause an opening for the Romans to exploit.
Right.
Corollary, there. Consular suicide, issue 4-5.
There you go.
It's only been 7.
But I think it's funny though, because I think it's very much the sacrifice aspect that's emphasized, not the idiocy aspect. Even at the Battle of Cannae, double envelopment was all going well according to the Roman idea of battle, because the Roman legion was going forward and the Carthaginians were pulling back. So that's technically, it was great, but it was leading into Hannibal's trap. So you get Horatius on the bridge. You get someone like Domitius Corbulo falling on his sword. What a pointless and utter point, but that's emphasized for its loyalty. That the emperor, who was jealous of him, demanded that he fall on his sword, and he did so. Which is
like Stilicho presenting himself for execution when the executioners came for him from Valentinian III. Yeah,
and in Gladiator.
How do you think attitudes? Do you think these attitudes to death affected the battlefield, affected the way the battle might go? Or, are they almost constructs to try and affect the real battlefield? These, I guess, if we call them stories, I don't know if that's the way to call them.
I think so, and I think the fact is that when you look at their legacy, they're still with us, really. You look at poems of, well, even war movies. They still inspire some young men to love military history who may or not be speaking right now. But Charge of the Light Brigade. There's all sorts of poems since the ancient world that have brought on that idea of inspiring great death stories and being soldiers and dying on the field of battle the right way. So I think absolutely that's what they were about. And I think they probably are a literary construct, because I think the reality of battle, not having ever been in one, but I think the reality of battle is probably far messier and far less heroic than the literature tells us. But the way that even veterans sometimes build the image of what happened on the battlefield is a literary construct, or a memory that's made to fit. And it's only really very recently, probably since The Face of Battle, that's begun to change. And some, war films has tried to show exactly how chaotic and horrible it is. But most still buy into the great death, and you can go into a pub and start talking about great movie deaths of warriors, and they'll start raving about how, it was great, it was awesome, which is not the truth of battle at all. But
they're certainly pushed into the face of the Romans, though, as well, because if you consider that going into the Forum in Rome and watching any speech or whatnot being given from the rostra during the Republic, there would be across the rostra various statues that were placed there commemorating people who had died in the name of the Republic. And even though they sort of get overshadowed in the last century of the Republic by figures of Sulla and Pompey and one other, they're still there until the imperial, they change the viewpoint of the Forum in the imperial period. But it's being shoved in the face of everyone. That doesn't have to be said to anybody. It's there, for all to see.
Well, even walking into into Athens, you go through the Keramakos, and most of those deaths are probably heroic, battle deaths. Even if they weren't, that's the story that's going to be told about that tomb and that person and that tomb and that person. And even the walking into Pompeii, for instance, you've got the same thing. The road is lined by tombs of great individuals. So that whole sort of idea of talking about the great death in battle of that individual is brought up by having their tomb and their sculpture displayed, because that's part of the anecdote. You talk about that person. We've got others, but it's unlikely that the great story of, he reformed the grain law is going to be told about XYZ, as opposed to the one in Pompeii where the tomb is actually a bench seat. I thought was the most amazing. Come sit on me and remember my life.
Yeah.
It's I was just thinking of how religion and beliefs to death might affect the battlefield, and it struck me that things like the Banzai charge, of the Second World War, are done under the understanding that you're going to go somewhere else. There's all kinds of religious connotations and connections you can make, pinpoints you could plop in the map going back in history where people did these sort of heroic things based on the fact that that death was just somewhere where you want to be. Can we see these kind of?
Haven't we discussed it recently that for the Romans and Greeks generally, it's not that much the case unless you manage to magically make it into Elysium. But
it's more likely that you're going to end up in limbo if you're Roman, in terms of saying, right, well, it's a violent death, and by violent death, that's where they get some of their ideas about ghosts who are lingering because of the violent death has not allowed them to.
I was going to say it for the ancients and maybe in general that the afterlife doesn't seem to be something they're very focused on, but so maybe therefore they're more interested in making sure that if and when they die, it's memorable so that people at least talk about
that concept of Gloria, really, Gloria and Famia and those sorts of things that you be talked about and you be remembered, that those are sort of dominant. But you do get a lot of obsessions, again in Greek and Roman epic, with traveling to the underworld, and they always meet warriors who've died. Both Odysseus and Aeneas meet warriors and things like that. So there is that sort of religious aspect to it, I suppose. And there's that semi-religious devotio that Mark was talking about. So there is sort of a religious aspect to sacrifice, even pointless sacrifice. But then, you think about decimation. That's pointless, but it's not. It's viewed as discipline, and
that's a perfect segue to this book.
What's that book? Listeners won't be able to see it.
Oh, come on! I thought we figured that out by now. How we do that in podcast? It's John Lennon, Lennon, Soldiers and Ghosts. He wrote about the ancient history too, and we've discussed it before. But the point that he makes for the Romans, warfare is a constant sort of push and pull between the two concepts that Murray just mentioned. Going for your personal fama and glory on the one hand, and the required discipline of the unit on the other. And not a there's been pushback, but certainly an interesting and pretty convincing argument that he makes.
Well, I think again you get the emphasis by certain anecdotes where I'm going to be the disciplined general, and then it's the father, the general's son, who's the one who breaks ranks and does something. And so the idea is, I sacrifice my son. Brutus sacrificing his sons. Those anecdotes of the glory of the state is above family glory. Again, to us, we read those as horrific, pointless, infanticides, if you like. But they're posted by the Romans as no, this is glorious dedication to state.
I made a note of a question which I think is nonsense that I dreamt up, which was how is a death for the average soldier? Which I guess no one ever writes about the death of the average soldier. No one's interested because it was probably not heroic. But Abraham on Patreon, sort of almost builds on that by saying, do we know if there was designated grave diggers or morticians to prepare bodies for the for soldiers? Do we know how how the dead on the battlefield were treated?
We get in again, I think in is it Catiline, where Sallust describes the sort of the horror of the battlefield, because it's a civil war. You get people turning over friend and enemy at the same time that they know.
Oh yeah.
And we get Tacitus describing the discovery of several battlefields where they're just bones and they've been left to lie there. So the implication of that is obviously there was no one left alive to actually bury anyone, so they didn't get buried.
That was what happened in the Teutoburg forest disaster.
Yeah.
That is, Germanicus came upon the remains of the Roman soldiers who had not been buried, obviously because the Romans were all destroyed.
Yeah, and I think you do get anecdotes of the desecration of the dead. The Scythians cutting heads off, and but then the ancient Egyptians would cut hands off to prove how many kills they'd gotten. We've got sculptural and literary depictions of warriors proving their worth by the number of hands they'd chopped off for their king and their pharaoh.
There are a few Roman tombstones where it's mentioned. I mean, Marcus Caelius is, of course, the most famous one, but that tombstone, it specifically says, if you ever find me bones, you can put them here.
Right.
There's a few other ones where it actually says this so-and-so died in battle there and then and there. And presumably he was buried at that tombstone in that case. The Adam Clissi monument in, is it Romania?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that a mass grave?
Mm.
Yeah.
There's a mention in Pausanias about going to the Battle of Marathon. Of course, you've sort of got the mound of the 192 cavalry from Athens being buried on the battle site. But then Pausanias makes the observation of when he visits the battle site, supposedly, saying it's noticeable that there's no graves for the Persians, and that he can't ascertain what happened to the Persian dead. And I believe subsequent there has been archaeological digs around and excavations going on that have basically supported this idea of saying it looks like probably Persian dead were just piled into mass graves at that point. So
but there was
in terms of just like a cleanup job rather than any respectful taking care of their needs as such.
Well, there's the great honor of being buried on a field for both the Plataeans and the Athenians, isn't there?
Yeah.
At Marathon and the Theban sacred band at Chaeronea.
Yeah.
And we know that the Chaeronea, under the Lion Monument, the graves, they were very strictly laid out, which is sort of emphasis to honor, which ties in with what Philip's saying in the accounts of the battle. But I think as in terms of there's no word for gravedigger in any military context. I don't think in the Latin.
I can't think of any.
Fossa in the Latin, but it's not to do with the military. It's to do with civilian, because you've got lots of evidence to do with Rome in terms of there was outside of the gates of Rome, there is a community at the Grove of Libertina, which is basically the grave diggers and morticians and the stretcher bearers. Basically, I can't think of the term, and they're all forced by law. They must live outside the city
because they're tainted.
Because they're tainted. And they can only come in. If they come into the city, they must wear. There's a red cap and there's some sort of other brightly coloured clothing. They must wear this inside the city and ring a bell anywhere they go. Right. But there's the support for that community outside of Rome. There's likewise a description of the same sort of community outside of Naples, or Puteoli near Naples. But they're the only two definite descriptions of these communities, and it's that it continues across the world.
You could postulate that those sorts of communities would send members as camp followers on military campaigns, couldn't you? Really?
Yeah. Or if it's near if there's a city nearby, you'd assume that maybe those people would be called upon to go out to the battle site if it's within a vicinity or.
Interesting. Yeah, but there's no military diploma that refers
I haven't
to be a
No.
Fossiarius. Would it be a Fossiarius? Or something?
I'm just looking. I've got the Domaszewski, die Rangordnung des römischen Heeres here. I mean, if it's a thing, it's going to be in here.
I can look it up now because I've got it here.
We've sent Jasper to the bookshelf and Mark to the.
Now, if you got the Kindle version, you could just type it in. You'd be there rather than us having to watch people flick through books.
You and your Kindle.
There's nothing more inspiring than the furrowed brow of a forehead deep in a book. I'm sorry, that's just. Where is it?
The old Germans, thorough old Germans about researching their Roman history.
You can't, You can't have to weighty tome and exercise your bicep with a Kindle.
This is not even that heavy. That your average modern iPad is heavier.
So I suspect by the fact that neither of you have found anything.
No, I don't think I don't think it's in there.
Okay, Undertakers.
Here we go.
Clegia. Here we go. Among the funeral specialists, I'm quoting from Valerie Hope, Roman Death. For those who could afford to employ them, undertakers may have taken substantial costs. Libertina was the goddess of funerals. She was not worshipped, but she was associated with a grove outside the Esquiline Gate, where items and services for burials could be purchased or hired. Among the funeral specialists were Politores, who prepared the body. I believe that comes from, it is based on the smell that was associated with perfumes that they applied. The Vespelones, who carried coffins and corpses. The Fossores, who dug graves. And the Ustores, who cremated bodies. There were also flautists, tivicines, horn players, mimes, dancers, dirge singers, the Praeficae, and mourners for hire. The designator might also organise and direct proceedings. Same has been found in Pozzuoli and Cumae.
Right.
So
those are domestic, and we might assume that they follow the army, but they're not.
Yeah, they're all urban ideas, basically.
Yeah.
I think it also extends to the executioners. Were lumped in with the same group. They also had to live.
They produced
like an exiled community outside of the city gates, and as well as that exiled community, what is interesting is that when you sort of then look at what else is outside of that gate, you also get basically the Roman equivalent of plague pits outside of that gate. For basically, these guys were responsible not just for attending nice funerals, but they also seem to be the guys who sweep up the unwanted dead bodies around the city, which of the lower classes that aren't able to pay for funerals, and they get rid of them outside the plague pits, in the pits, which by the time of Augustus are smelling so bad that Maecenas actually ends up building his gardens over the top of them because he has to bring in 13 foot of soil to put on top of them, basically to seal them off, and then build his gardens on top so that nobody is actually going to build a building over it. So I'll stop now.
Fortunately, I've had dinner already.
Well, as we're talking about specialists, we did have another question from Ellis, who queried who was designated torturers that we read so much about in novels, but never actually get any information on, or is that because they didn't exist?
I don't think
that came out of left field.
Well, we were talking about specialists.
I don't think we have any evidence of torturers. And armies immemorial. I don't think they emphasized that that was anything that they did. Yeah, I mean, there's again,
Well, except
you
the
go.
Assyrians, of course.
But
you know, you
gruesome
gotta-
death is one of those things where you know you do get you know desecration of bodies and things. I guess that's after they've died, not necessarily whilst you're trying to extract
There is
information.
a description in Livy, isn't it, during the early Republic of the execution. I can't remember who it was that tied to 4 horses and ripped to shreds. Although then they sort of ban that from then on because they reckon it's too gruesome. So.
Oh.
I think. I mean, there is the Dolonaea in the Iliad where Diomedes and Odysseus essentially torture Dolon in no man's land of the Trojan War, you know, and promise him all sorts of things if he tells them where Achilles' horses are, which he can't. So he says, no, there's better horses by Rhesus. So he tells them where Rhesus is. And they go, yeah, you're great. And then they chop his head off. And then they go and kill Rhesus and take his horses. So there, you know, which is, again, that's kind of appalling. But at the same time, it's emphasized for its trickiness because it's Odysseus being tricky. Yeah. But there's another mythical tie-in for that as well. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to remember other, because there's no extraction of information in the pulling apart by 4 horses. It's just
No,
death.
it's just punishment.
It's punishment, not
Execution details.
So it's just a different
Yeah.
thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think most of the punishments we get recorded are not necessarily to find things out. They are to punish for things done, and therefore, you know, you have to suffer this punishment.
Don't they have a torture in that? I'm sure it was in that documentary, The Life of Brian.
Yes.
So I think the answer is A, we don't know, and B, we don't know. To that.
Is it likely that somebody ever did tell us or else? Yeah. I mean,
It's interesting that it's come up as a fiction, you know, I guess it's a modern fictitious construct, but, you know, that we're placing on the past. But it's an interesting one that it does come up all the time in fiction, you know, the role of the torturer, which must be a more, presumably medieval or something on, well, unless they...
maybe we just, you know...
Actually, there is...
I was just not aware.
There is, in terms of Roman slaves, there's a mention of torture in terms of if a slave is brought before a court,
that's right.
that they're supposed to be tortured.
Because otherwise, you're not sure that they're going to be telling the truth.
But I don't know that there's any specifics of labeling exactly who's responsible for that, or if it's just, I'm not sure.
Not what civilized people do, so it doesn't get written down. It doesn't fit into their idea of themselves. Is that why we have no evidence?
No, that I don't think you can. Making an argument ex silencio is always very difficult with the ancient world. There's just too many gaps.
When it comes to the Roman law courts, it's the speeches of the lawyers like Cicero that you get, and unless there is a purpose to it, then they're not going to mention the ins and outs of the normal procedure of court. So,
shall we move on to what I guess is the second part? We've been looking at death, dying, and killing. You know, about capturing. You know, if we're talking about our 4 on the battlefield. What about capturing our 4? Is a historical evidence of ransoming captive enemies like we see in the Iliad?
I can think of one instance of an enemy, or excuse me, a prisoner who was ransomed back by the Romans or exchanged somehow. That would have been Cornelius Scipio Asina, who was the commander of a Roman squadron in 260 BC. He was lured into a trap in the Lipari Isles by the Carthaginian fleet. His squadron was captured. He was the squadron fled. All of the ships were captured. He was captured by the Carthaginians. But we find him as the consul of Rome several years later. So the supposition is that the Romans and the Carthaginians had some form of prisoner exchange going on during those years. It was an extremely long war, lasting from 264 BC to 241. So it would make sense that there would be this desire to get your own people back by exchanging prisoners you had taken. Dating from that same war, the First Punic War, there is the story of Marcus Attilius Regulus, who was one of the victorious commanders at the naval battle of Ecnomus in 256 BC. He also then took command of the Roman army that was landed in North Africa right after the battle. He came up to Carthage and started demanding, made exorbitant demands on the Carthaginians when they came out to have some sort of negotiated settlement. The Carthaginians decided to fight. They hired also a Spartan soldier by the name of Xanthippus, who whipped their army into shape. And led by Xanthippus, the Carthaginians defeated the Romans. This would have been 255 BC, defeated the Romans and took Marcus Attilius Regulus prisoner. There is a story which I think is of dubious authenticity, but this is the story as it exists, that Marcus Attilius was allowed to return to Rome as part of some sort of peace negotiations, and he told the Romans, do not make any sort of peace. And then, in fulfillment of his promise to return to the Carthaginians, that is, this is Roman honor that we're talking about, he goes back and the Carthaginians execute him. So there are those two stories of relatively famous examples of prisoner exchange.
But most prisoners, of course, become booty and therefore, fit to be sold as slaves.
Well, we do get the anecdote of Caesar, of course, being captured and ransomed, but he escapes. So, there's capture and I think there is capture and ransom, but it's not emphasized much, is it?
So there's an economy to war, so you can either capture people and ransom them, or capture people and they've got booty. They are booty. They have a value as slaves. And I wonder at what point then do people fight a battle to capture booty, or do they, fight a battle to slaughter? Does that affect a battle?
And now we're going to get into the argumentation about whether Rome was purposely, especially the Republic, was an economy that was driven by conquest and therefore by the booty that you get from conquest, which consists for a very large part of slaves that you can sell and that can help the economy further. And
which puts the idea of killing your enemy, not necessarily as first thing on the agenda. Winning is obviously first thing on the agenda, but then if you can capture your enemy,
those same reliefs that Murray just mentioned from Egypt and the ancient Near East that have, you have the post-battle scenes where you have stacks of hands or ears or just piles of bodies. On those same reliefs, you see long columns of prisoners being taken, undoubtedly to become slaves. So, you prove to be manly by killing them, and you improve the economy by capturing them.
Does that mean people don't write about capturing tens of thousands of slaves because it's not necessarily manly?
Well, there's that story that Julius Caesar basically destroys the economy by capturing so many slaves in Gaul that the slave market is kind of flooded. That slaves are to a penny kind of thing, to a denarii or whatever. I was just thinking also, at the end of the Battle of Sphacteria, the Spartans do ransom their 120 homoioi. So there is evidence of it.
But it all points to status. I'm sure the Athenians would have been aware that those homoioi were going to be very valuable bargaining chips, essentially.
Yeah. Whereas at the end of the Sicilian campaign, tough luck. They're captured, but they aren't.
Yeah, but there's thousands of them, and then you have to ship them back to Athens, and if Athens even wants them anymore.
Yep.
Another question from one of our Patreons, Bronwyn, wonders if there's any evidence or reflections on mercy killings for wounded or crippled soldiers.
Other than Alexander the movie.
Mercy killings.
Or is that just not something that sort of fits in with their idea of war and heroism, so it doesn't get mentioned? Or is it too far down the food chain of any writers to be worried about?
I can't think of any mercy killing off the top of my head.
Wonderful. We've completely stumped ourselves. We haven't even got to go off left field with something to get round the question. we have done that wonderful politician thing of answering the question you wish was asked.
We've done that. We've done the horrible politician thing of dead air, of just sitting there staring, going, "Oh."
Yeah, but that's because we trust in Angus going snip.
Yeah. Tumbleweed.
I've increased jobs. I've increased employment.
So
I can't think of a mercy killing. I can't think of a mercy killing that is either described or even that we would reinterpret as a mercy killing. In the gladiatorial arena, you have slaves who come on and ensure that the gladiators are dead. So there is, I suppose, in that sense, if they're very badly wounded, they will come on and kill them.
Yeah, but that's with a red hot poker. That's not exactly mercy.
Yeah, but it's not exactly. But the emphasis there, is on the gladiator not faking their death rather than mercy killing or anything kind. But it is pointed out as appropriate. But then the same thing, with gladiatorial death is that we have all these tombstones of gladiators who lose fights. I won 23 fights, lost 8. Like, hang on, wait, whoa, what? Lost 8? How is this possible? And our concept of gladiatorial combat always being someone dying is just not true.
Yeah.
And the number of tombstones with the amazing forgiveness or mercy hand gesture, which then gets adopted by Christian iconography. So that is a gladiatorial thing. You get those wonderful tombstones, and there's just a hand coming out of nowhere, not pointing a gun, but forgiving, because that would be clearly anachronistic. But that sort of, there is mercy, and we've got it in the thumbs up, thumb down perennial debate that we've got it wrong. But I suppose there is mercy.
That's more mete, like send them back to to fight another day. It's not the mercy that we would interpret in the modern world as such. I was just wondering, could we include the scenario that Josephus describes when he's besieged and when he's down the well with these companions, and they decide they're very questionable suicide pact? Is that can that be considered a mercy killing?
And Masada, yeah. But again, I think the way that that's emphasized is heroic, heroic death, not suicide. It's we rob them of their victory. Yeah. I mean, Spartacus too. The fact that they can't identify the body of Spartacus is bizarrely emphasized in the sources
Actually,
as a way of.
Reminds me that I don't know if this was normal procedure, but in the Christ story, the poking in the liver with a spear is often interpreted as a mercy killing. If you're not already dead after hanging there for a couple hours.
Yeah.
There's also Nero. And there's the story of Nero, when he's decided that everyone's against him, and goes to his gladiator friend, Milo. Am I saying the wrong name here? Asks for help. No, it's not Milo. But he asks for help in terms of killing himself, and the help is not forthcoming as such. He refuses a mercy killing at that stage.
But again, I think that's part of the ignominious death, isn't it? Really, that's how low he's
again.
But see, again, the suicide of Cleopatra isn't regarded as, it's a heroic death, if you like.
There's also the Augustus's own death. In one version is again, it's not a mercy killing, but it's not quite, but it is a assisted suicide by his wife because his plans have not been fulfilled because he's all of a sudden got better. But it is, I don't know, it's as close as you can get.
So do you think we've flogged Death, Dying, and Killing enough? Are we out of steam? Jasper, what are we talking about next time? What's the next issue of the magazine about?
You caught me off guard, you rotter.
Well, you usually manage quite successfully with Guy, who always takes by surprise when you ask him what his magazine's about. He never seems to remember.
Yeah, it's true. It's because we as editors we tend to be already on the next one, and they're like, no, issue 12.3 is about to return from the printer, and it is it's about armor. This is the first time ever that we came back to a topic that we'd done before, but I heard it's
when did we do armor? I don't recall us talking about armor.
Well, it was issue 1-3.
That could be why. Maybe that's just before we started, so we might never have talked about armor.
Didn't we go back after in the first year? We went back and we discussed Agricola and daily life and armor in Spain.
Maybe. So what articles are in it?
We got quite a few. We have an article about the very first type, early experiments with armor. We have a couple things looking at the male armor of the Celts, whether it came from the Celts or not. We have an article about how the Roman army adapts to meeting different enemies. We have an article about late Roman arms and armor supply, how the Romans arrange that, or as far as we can see how it works. We have an article on the Battle of Turin, where the Clibanarii, who are of course the ultimate armored warrior, one of them anyway, of the ancient world, gets defeated, and as a kind of a metaphysical armor, an article about magical protection about the Roman army. It kind of appears that if you want to be a good reenactor, you shouldn't just have the right kit. You should probably be covered in all kinds of amulets and potentially some flowers. Although Caracalla didn't approve of that. I thought about having an illustration done about that, but I thought maybe that's too silly.
And if people don't already subscribe to the magazine, where can they subscribe to the magazine?
www.ancient-warfare.com.
There you go. So have we covered everything that we had on our checklist? Anyone want to add anything?
Did we answer all the questions from Facebook and Patreon and any other
Well, the only potential one we missed was how severe is the plague in Athens during the Peloponnesian War to undermine them? How much population recovery to contest Spartan hegemony?
It was very serious.
Yes, yeah. I think we should stop at it was very severe.
I would say that's about as succinct as I can make it. Approximately 1/3 estimate of the total population of Athens was felled by the plague, which first appeared in 430 and then returned again in 427. The estimate of 1/3 is based upon the report by Thucydides that roughly 1/3 of the hoplites of Athens perished. The Athenians also lost, I think, maybe 1/4 of their cavalry. That is, the people who actually could serve as horsemen in their army. So it was an extremely the most famous victim of all of the plague was Pericles himself. Here's what I think, if you were going to say, well, what was the effect of the plague on Athens, is that it was very damaging and it certainly hurt them during the war. They were nevertheless able to hold on and win in, I would say, the first phase of the Peloponnesian War, the Archidamian War, as it's called. One of the things about Athens is remarkable is that they're not only their staying power despite the plague, but also the fact that they were able to rejuvenate themselves. People then grew up and came to manhood and staffed their armies, so that by the time that the Sicilian expedition was being contemplated and undertaken in 415 BC, it was almost as if the plague had not, I don't want to say that it hadn't occurred, but it certainly had not slowed them or kept them, made them more conservative in their ambitions. Their ambitions were still very large, and they undertook the attack on Sicily, which ended in disaster. So what I would say about the plague is that it hurt very badly, but it didn't keep the Athenians from ultimately engaging in self-defeating behaviors that ultimately brought them to ruin. Many, many years later, obviously. So that would be my take on it.
Possibly the worst thing that happened with it was actually the effect on the political landscape of Athens in terms of the change of direction that came about because of the losing of Pericles, and if you look later on the rise of the new demagogues.
Yeah, I think the loss of Pericles' vision was probably the biggest effect of the plague. But then there are plagues in the Roman. The plague of 165 is regarded as one of the worst, the one that Lucius Verus brings back from Parthia.
This is why you should never have a co-emperor. They just and they're very common. Whenever an army returns from a foreign campaign, they generally bring a plague back with them. So
there you go. There you go, Brian. Hope that answers your question. That's all my questions. That's all my ticky boxes. I think we've got everything that you guys had all mentioned beforehand in.
Excellent.
So there we go. So thanks for our viewers for watching. We'll see you in a few weeks. I think we have ourselves by our own calendar should be only in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it should be October 5th.
Ooh, look how fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, there we go. So
ask him what's in the magazine. No idea. Ask him.
Yeah. Right. Thanks to our patrons. Good night or good morning if you're in Australia.